Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. In today's video, what I want to do is to discuss what are called the dog and cow duty ascetics. It's a sutta from the early tradition that a viewer recently asked me to comment on, to give a video on. It's a funny, a weird and funny sutta that has a certain number of implications about, in particular, the Buddha's views on different strategies to reach liberation, as well as his views on karma in general, on the proper way for us to act. In this sutta, the Buddha is approached by a couple of ascetics named Sanya and Punna. Sanya has taken a vow to behave like a dog, and Punna has taken a vow to behave like a cow. Now, according to Bhikkhu Bodhi, a contemporary translator and scholar of this early material, he says that when he was in India several decades ago, he saw ascetics just like these practicing in this way. So this may indeed be an ascetic tradition that goes down to the present day. I don't know this personally, but at least that's what he says. In any event, one of these ascetics comes up to the Buddha and asks him a question. That is to say, Punna asks about Sanya. He says this: "Sir, this naked dog ascetic Sanya does a hard thing. He eats food placed on the ground. For a long time he's undertaken that observance to behave like a dog. Where will he be reborn in his next life?" Now, this encounter may be intended to be satirical, in that an ascetic practicing like a cow would find an ascetic practicing like a dog to be sort of strange and questionable, and so want to ask the Buddha about it to find the Buddha's opinion. In any event, the Buddha declines to answer this question. He declines to answer it twice. In other words, Punna asks him twice, the Buddha declines to answer twice, Punna asks a third time, and then the Buddha decides to answer it. And this is actually a trope in early Buddhism, that if the Buddha is asked a question that he knows the answer to, that he has an answer to, but doesn't want to answer, if he's asked 3 times, he will answer it, whether he wants to or not, basically. And what does the Buddha say? What the Buddha says is that someone who wants to develop a dog's ethics, a dog's mentality, and a dog's behavior fully and uninterruptedly will be reborn as a dog in the next life. That's clearly not what Sanya was looking for. And the Buddha goes on to say that if Sanya wanted to become a deity in the next life, in other words, expected that this kind of practice would lead to his eventual deification in the next life, then Sanya would end up in hell. This is a very strong claim. It's one that actually Bhikkhu Bodhi, who I mentioned earlier, finds a little too strong. In other words, Bhikkhu Bodhi thinks this doesn't really sound very correct, because it's not like this practice of wanting to behave like a dog is really harming anybody. But nevertheless, that's what the Buddha says. Presumably, or perhaps, what the Buddha means is that he's going to be sorely disappointed in the next life. In other words, he's going to find unhappiness if he believes that this kind of practice is going to lead to something like deification. It's important to keep in mind the cultural context as well of ancient India. Dogs were not really thought of as pets in that context. They were thought of more like semi-wild animals, so far as we can tell, I think, from the ancient suttas, and cows do not seem to have been treated as holy animals at that time either, at least in the ancient suttas that we find in Buddhism. So we have to keep that in mind. The Buddha's view was that animals lived in what he termed the animal realm, which is separate from the human realm, in that the animal realm was a realm more of suffering, more of the base kind of living, of trying to get food and just survive your day-to-day without any real chance to hear or understand the Dharma. So it was a life that the Buddha considered lower than the human realm. It was a life of more hardship, and that's the kind of thing that he's thinking of when he's saying that somebody who practices like a dog will be reborn as a dog. In any event, on hearing this, Sanya, the person practicing as a dog, breaks into tears, and clearly is very sad and disappointed to hear this from the Buddha. And the Buddha says, essentially, that's why I didn't want to answer this question. I knew that it was going to be a question that would be difficult for you to hear an answer to. But nevertheless, then Senia goes and asks the Buddha about punna's practice, about the practice of behaving like a cow. And indeed, as you won't be surprised to hear, the Buddha says the same thing, that somebody who wants to practice a cow's ethics and a cow's behavior and so on for a long period of time is going to be reborn as a cow, and if they expect that that's going to lead to some kind of deification, they're going to end up in hell, or we might say a little bit more pleasantly that they're going to be at least disappointed. Now, this discourse, I think, highlights a very important point about the Buddha's views on karma. As the Buddha said quite famously, actually, in a different sutta, he says, "Monks, whatever a monk frequently thinks and ponders upon, that will become the inclination of his mind." In other words, as we think, as we ponder, as we act over and over again in a particular way, that sort of thought and action lays down, we might consider sort of mental grooves that become deeper and deeper and harder to escape. This is the way that our behavior reinforces itself over time if we continue to do it. And that reinforcement leads to, eventually, in a traditional sense, literal rebirth. In other words, the grooves that we lay down in this life lead to the character of how we are going to be reborn into the literal next life in a traditional understanding. But this can also be understood metaphorically, that laying down these grooves determines how we are going to appear and be reborn into the next second, the next minute, the next year, the rest of our lives. This is the way that we are going to determine who we think we really are, based on the grooves that we've laid down in the past, our grooves of thinking, of acting, of behaving among other people is going to lay down these senses of self. To take an example, if we frequently think and ponder about becoming a chef, if we, in the Buddha's words, develop a chef's ethics, a chef's mentality, and a chef's behavior fully and uninterruptedly over a lengthy period of time, we're more than likely going to become a chef. We're going to identify with being a chef. We're going to think of ourselves in terms of chef, of, that's who I am. You might say that doing this is going to make it more likely that we will be reborn into chefhood in our next life, whether that's a literal next life, if we are traditional believers in that thing, or a figurative next life into the next week or the next year. That's how we become a chef. However, continuing along in the Buddha's claims, if we think that chefhood is going to somehow deify us, we're going to be sorely disappointed and perhaps have to undergo a certain amount of suffering. And indeed, this is part of the problem, is that chefs, we might say in particular, tend to puff themselves up. It gets into the ego a great deal. Indeed, many of the top chefs tend to have that kind of ego mentality that keeps them going, but that can also be a stumbling block in their achievement of true mental calm and liberation. Many of us, through our activities, through our practices, through our livelihoods, get kind of puffed up by egoism and conceit in just this way, thinking it's going to lead to great and enormous, even godlike powers in the future for us, if not literally, then at least figuratively. And so this is a good reminder that whatever we choose for our livelihood is not going to be truly liberative in that way. And it's also a good reminder of what the Buddha had to say about clinging to rites and rituals, or to rules and observances. This is a point that the Buddha made several times in the early texts, that clinging to these sorts of rules and observances, or rites and rituals, is, again, not going to lead to our true liberation. What we find in Punna and Senia is two paradigmatic, or people who paradigmatically clung to certain kinds of rituals, certain kinds of observances, thinking that simply by behaving a certain way they were going to become liberated. And the Buddha's response here is that simply behaving a certain way only ends up that you are going to be laying down these kinds of tracks that will get you reborn in a certain sense. That liberation involves more than simply behaving in a certain way, more than simply following a certain kind of ritual observance. Now, I did an earlier video about this whole idea of clinging to rites and rituals, and I will leave a link to it up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to take another look at it. Thanks so much for watching. If you're getting something out of these videos of mine, consider taking a look at my Patreon page, which is linked down below, and seeing if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.